Good evening. Welcome to William Penn University and the Leader Speak series. As a reminder, this presentation is live streamed. So when we reach the question and answer phase of the presentation, just raise your hand and we'll come around with the microphone, and that way the people watching on the live stream will hear your question also. Tonight we're going to learn from the research of Dr. Tracy Lucht, an associate professor at Iowa State University's Greenlee School of Journalism. Dr. Lucht holds a PhD from the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. She has worked at the Washington Post, USA Today, and the Des Moines Register. Dr. Lucht is the author of Sylvia Porter, America's Original Personal Finance Columnist, and co-author of the book Mad Men and Working Women, Feminist Perspectives on Historical Power, Resistance, and Otherness. Tonight, she will share what she has learned from researching female journalists in the Midwest. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lucht.
Thank you. Do we have the mic working? Yes, perfect. Thank you so much to Professor Willits and to all of you for being here tonight. As Professor Willits said, my research focuses on the history and experiences of women with the mass media in the U.S. I look at the biographies and contributions of women in journalism and different forms of programming and content. I am always excited to talk about my research, as anyone who asks me about it learns the hard way. But I am particularly excited about talking to you tonight because I like this idea of thinking about some of these women's stories and what they can tell us on a more personal and pragmatic level. Much of what I do as a scholar is what we would call recovery work, meaning that I go to archives, I read oral histories, I conduct interviews, and I dig out the stories and contributions of people who really did significant work, but for some reason have not made it into the history books. And I recover their stories and try to make sure that they get the recognition that they deserve. But just as important, I think, as asking who these people were and what they did, I find that it's been really important to ask how they did it. And so that's where I think that we can get some lessons, where I've gotten some lessons from the women that I've studied, and I hope that some of those lessons might resonate with you as well. So I really hope that this can be a discussion and interactive, and I hope that that you can reflect a little bit too on the people in your life that maybe you've learned lessons in leadership and community from, but maybe who haven't gotten the kind of recognition that they deserve. So, as Professor Willits said, my most recent scholarship has been on women broadcasters in the Midwest. So, the two questions that I get most often about this are, number one, why women in broadcasting? And number two, why the Midwest? The joke that I have made is that we are flyover country even in the research, right? A lot of media research is done on outlets on the East Coast, on the West Coast, in large metropolitan areas, and people tend to forget about the heartland in the middle of the country. And that turns out to be significant in women's history, and I want to tell you why that is. So, to the question of why broadcasting, I had studied women in print journalism, but I was really interested in looking at women's engagement with new technologies. Now, it might be kind of strange to think about radio and television as being new, but they were 20th century inventions, and that turned out to be really significant for women. And hopefully I'll be able to convince you of that a little bit later. And secondly, why the Midwest? So I get the question, why the Midwest? And it's an argument that I have to make. Why is this important? So I want to answer that by providing a little bit of context. Then I want to tell you about some individual women that I think you should all know about. And then I want to finish with a broader look at how these women went about their work and what that might teach us about our own leadership, our own communities and where we might go moving forward. So to provide a little bit of context, I'll give you just a couple of visuals. If you look at the history of broadcasting in this country, this is what it typically looks like in terms of the noteworthy events, right? Radio stations, as we would recognize them, started broadcasting in 1920. In 1922, there was a boom in radio licenses being sought from what was then the Federal Radio Commission. Right? The networks come along in 1926, 1927, and then the 1930s and 40s are what are considered the golden age of radio. Right? You all have heard of FDR's fireside chats, and I'm sure you're familiar with the importance of radio as an entertainment medium during the Great Depression. It had its golden age before television comes along in the 1940s. The technology for television had been there for quite a while, but because of patent disputes and war, television doesn't make it into households until 1946. In terms of women's history, a lot of focus has been on this period in the 1960s and the 1970s. And if you know very much about history, I'm sure it's not hard to understand why that would be, right? That would coincide with what was called the second wave feminist movement. A lot of activism was happening in the 1960s and 70s surrounding equal rights for women, women's rights in the workplace. And part of that activism led to what was now the Federal Communications Commission in 1971 adding women to their diversity requirement for stations that wanted to renew their licenses. So in 1971, the FCC tells radio and television stations, you have to show us that you are representing your communities well and equitably, and that you're doing that by including women and racial and ethnic minorities in your programming and management structures. So a lot of the history has focused on that particular period for women because it was a really important one. But what's really interesting is that if you look at the history through the experiences of Midwestern women, our timeline shifts a little bit in terms of the noteworthy events. And you notice in the very early years of broadcasting, Midwestern women were influential, making significant contributions, and determining a lot of the programming and the content that would become really popular on both of these media. And there are a number of notable firsts among women in broadcasting that have Midwestern roots, starting with a woman named Marie Zimmerman from Vinton, Iowa, who in 1922, this was the year of the boom in licensing, became the first woman in the country to own a licensed radio station. Now, not much is known about the effort, and it didn't last long. It only lasted about a year. But that same year in Chicago, Judith Waller becomes the first woman to be a station manager. And I'll tell you more about her in a little bit. And you can kind of go on through the years and start to see that some of these firsts, Dorothy Fuldheim, who was the first woman to anchor a television news program, she did that in Cleveland, Ohio, starting in 1947. And some of you, I know, will recognize the name Heidi Soliday. How many of you recognize the name Heidi Soliday? Okay, so she was the first woman in the country to be a sports director at a TV station, and that was in Des Moines, Iowa. It was really interesting to me as I started approaching this research that, I grew up in West Des Moines. I grew up watching Heidi Soliday, and having grown up with her, it never struck me as anything unusual. It was just normal to me. But it wasn't until I started doing some of this research that I realized that was actually a pretty big deal. It was a pretty significant thing to have a female sports reporter, let alone a female sports director in this kind of market. So this is why women in broadcasting in the Midwest. I think it's interesting to ask, what was going on here? What was it about their culture? What was it about their communities that gave women opportunities, especially early on? So I'd like to tell you about some of the most notable women that I've studied. These are names that, if you take away nothing else from tonight, these are names that should stick with you. So I mentioned Judith Waller. Her story began in 1922 when she got a station called WMAQ on the air in Chicago. It was a station that was started by the Chicago Daily News. It was the second radio station in Chicago. She got the job through a family friend who was a business manager at the Chicago Daily News, who saw potential in her and called her into his office and said, you know, I'm starting this radio station and I want you to head it up. And she reports saying to him, you know, I don't even know what a radio is. And he says, none of us do. Like, it's fine. You'll figure it out. Which speaks to the experimental nature of what they were doing. Nobody knew what they were doing. They just tried things to see if they would work. So what's significant about her was that she stayed at WMAQ until 1931. She had risen to become a vice president. She brought the Chicago Cubs to radio. And they were actually the first team to allow an entire home season of their games to be broadcast on a local station. She negotiated with William Wrigley Jr. in 1926 to broadcast the Cubs' entire home season. As she told the story, this young son of a friend of hers had been ill and had complained that he couldn't make it to the ballpark, which inspired her to bring the ballpark to him. Now, she would also say she didn't know if Wrigley was intrigued that a woman had this idea, or if he was just, you know, interested in the idea, but he agreed to it. And the team's financial situation improved considerably in the following year, even if its standings did not. But they sold more tickets, and Judith Waller always pointed out that women made up a large number of the increased ticket sales. So she always found that interesting. She also brought a show to radio, or to a WMAQ in 1928. That show had been titled Sam and Henry. She renamed it, and it was titled Amos and Andy, which is probably a pretty recognizable title to a lot of you. It went on to become one of the longest running and most popular radio shows in history. She brought a couple named Marion and Jim Jordan, later known as Fibber, McGee, and Molly, to the air. So a lot of what we recognize about radio as an entertainment medium actually came from the brain of Judith Waller. And I will mention that in the 3-volume standard history of broadcasting, she wrote a book about radio. She literally wrote the book on radio, which is cited as a footnote, but she never makes it into the story that got told about radio. So a lot of her contributions have gone unrecognized. She also believes strongly in educational and public service programming. She started a radio club for children, getting 275,000 children involved throughout schools in the Chicago area. She created America's School of the Air because she was hired eventually by William Paley at CBS. So she's a pretty significant person to know about. The second person I want you to know about is Fran Harris from Detroit. Now, in contrast to Judith Waller, who started in a management capacity, Fran Harris got her start in radio doing something that was considered very traditional for women at the time. She was on various homemaker shows that were sponsored by retailers in the 1930s. Department stores and companies would hire various women and brand them. They would give them a name like Betty Crocker. The idea being that if we brand them with one name, we can just cycle various women into these roles, right? And any of the cachet would stay with the brand, and it wouldn't stay with the individual women who were actually sort of playing the part, right? Fran Harris went to Grinnell College. She graduated from Grinnell and got her job at WWJ in Detroit through the Himmelhoch Brothers department store. She lost her job for a while during the Depression when all 8 Julia Hayeses brand name, different cities, were canceled. However, when Nancy Dixon, her next brand, was canceled in 1942 during World War II, she began to advocate for a job in news, which wasn't something that women were traditionally allowed to do. They were told that their voices did not carry over the radio, that nobody would trust news coming from a woman. She said she was told, quote, they don't have the authority in their voices, they're too shrill, they're just not acceptable to do the news. She persisted, she asked for an audition, she finally got one and became Michigan's first female news broadcaster. She was the first woman in Michigan to go on television when that medium arrived. And what is most interesting about her is that she focused on social issues. So she talked about pedophilia, she talked about mental illness, she talked about things that we would consider pretty edgy in the 1940s, in the 1950s. She emphasized dialogue around these sorts of issues and getting different viewpoints around the table to talk about them. She also started the first court TV program, which she called Traffic Court, based on real court cases. And I think now we would all recognize court TV as a genre that's pretty popular and pretty prevalent. And that started with Fran Harris. Finally, Dorothy Fuldheim started her radio career in 1942. But it was 1947 that she went on television, and that became her medium. As she said, quote, no one thought I would make it, but there have been times when I could say things and get away with them only because I am a woman in a man's world. The sponsor of her TV news program in the beginning was Duquesne Beer, and when they found out that a woman was going to be their anchor, they were none too pleased. Nevertheless, she persisted and ended up having a decades-long TV career in Cleveland. She did 5,000 interviews over the course of her career. She interviewed Hitler, Helen Keller, Albert Einstein, all the presidents. You know, she was an institution in Cleveland to the effect that, you know, any visiting public figure had to stop by and be interviewed by Dorothy Fuldheim. In 1984, a local newspaper columnist in Cleveland said he had realized that there were no statues of women in the city. And he said, the first woman who always comes to mind at a time like this is Dorothy Fuldheim. The best possible thing that could happen would be if somebody could whack out a statue of Dorothy Fuldheim instantly and have it placed in a prominent spot by dawn tomorrow. But I'm not entirely sure a statue of Dorothy Fuldheim can be manufactured that quickly, especially one that pleased Dorothy Fuldheim. And if it didn't please her, she'd go and complain to Johnny Carson about it, and then where would we be? She was a popular guest on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Okay, Mary D. In Chicago was one of the first black women news anchors. And I was actually able to interview Mary D., who has probably the most harrowing story of any of the women that I've studied. She attended a school called Midwestern Broadcasting in Chicago in the early 1960s. Had planned to be an engineer, but ended up on the air at WBEE, which was a black-owned station in Harvey, Illinois. She always emphasized the role that necessity had played in forcing her into a career. She said, quote, I never turned anything down. I was very inquisitive, and I was also very desperate. I needed a job. I wasn't looking at a career. I was looking at a job. So she moved from radio to television. Before she got to WGN, she actually worked for a small community station called WSNS in Chicago. She had a talk show on that station, and she was leaving one night with a guest of the program when a man with a gun showed up and kidnapped her and her guest, drove them to a wooded area, shot and killed her guest, and shot her in the head, and she survived. She not only survived, but a year after that, she was hired by WGN. And as she told me, when I asked about some of her experiences, which included discriminatory comments and harassing behavior, she said, I figured they'd already put 244s in my head. What else could they do to me? You know, my win was my attitude, and I just kept at it. And she would become a victim's rights advocate. Her story became pretty well known nationally, and she continued working at WGN in various capacities, through the 1980s and until her retirement. Jill Geisler of Milwaukee is one of the first women news directors in the country. And not only that, but her number two, when she was news director, was also a woman. So they were the only TV station in the country to have two women in charge. And one of the ways she said that they went about trying to be leaders and to create an inclusive culture was by opening the doors to family members and really creating an environment where people found it easier to balance work and family. That was in 1978. So it was only a few years after she had tried to get a job at a TV station in Madison when the manager who was interviewing her asked if she could cook and sew. And she was trying really hard to be polite and said, well, she thought that maybe she had more to offer than that. At which point he stopped the interview and said, oh, I made a mistake. You want to be one of the boys. And she said, no, sir, I want to be one of the reporters. And 6 years later, not only was she one of the reporters, but she was one of the first female news directors. And finally, Heidi Soliday, the first woman in the country to be a sports director. She was first hired at KCCI in 1976. Became sports director in 1990. And she talked about the value of coming from a large family. People knew her family. She'd been an athlete, a competitive swimmer, which she felt had given her an edge. And she said about her success, she just said, I was a hard worker, I was knowledgeable, I didn't take any guff from anybody, I was kind of a tomboy. So these are just a few examples of women who have made significant contributions from this part of the country. I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention Wynn Speece, who was the neighbor lady in Yankton, South Dakota, one of the longest running radio programs in history. Evelyn Birkby and the radio homemakers of Shenandoah, Iowa, who pioneered food and garden programming. So there's any number of women that we could talk about, but what I really want to focus on is how did they do this? Because in a lot of cases, these women did face discrimination. They were told no. They persisted anyway. And part of what I want to understand as a scholar is how did they do that? What were their strategies? And what can we all learn from their success? So I want to give you 4 themes to think about: community, inclusion, dialogue, and creativity. These are 4 themes that I've seen come up again and again in these women's stories. The first is community, right? And there's a couple of quotations from 2 of the women. These women placed community at the center of their lives. They believed in giving back. They believed in supporting others and uplifting their communities. They tended to define those communities geographically. They put a lot of emphasis on their hometowns. They volunteered for events. They participated in fundraisers. They were active in their churches. They visited schools. They made sure that their stations were connected to the community. And what I've been able to see from this is that we tend to think of those efforts as being for the collective good, and they are. But what I've been able to see is that it also helps them individually. So this communitarian approach, this giving back to others, it's not just altruistic, right? It can also serve people as individuals, as professionals. And that's what these women did really well. Jill Geisler talked about volunteering for fundraisers. She talked about volunteering to be a union representative. Anywhere that there was work that needed to be done, these were the type of women who stepped in and did that. And so I think sometimes we have a tendency to treat community success and individual success as if they're separate, but for these women, they were one and the same. And it came back to their benefit in terms of their audience support. So that time period that I talked about that was really important, and it gets a lot of emphasis in women's history, the 1960s and the 1970s. That's a time when women are interviewing for jobs and are being told, well, I sure hope you're on birth control because we wouldn't want you getting pregnant. Or, no, our market just isn't ready for a woman in this role. And it turned out that the communities were very supportive of these women, and they reported that. So the women who were pregnant on the air would get showered with baby gifts and cards and support from the community. Jill Geisler would talk about riding in parades in Milwaukee, and people in the, on the streets would stand up and clap for her. So their communities were a source of support for them, and it helped them make the argument then to the owners and managers that, you know what, the market is ready for women in these particular roles. The audiences do support us. So that's one strategy. The second strategy, or the second theme that I've observed in these stories, is inclusion. There's a tendency among people who study the media to think of broadcasting as what we would call one-to-many communication, right? There's a tendency to think of it as pretty linear and one-directional. However, I've noticed that the way women, especially in this part of the country, used radio and television was much more interactive than that, right? Women in the U.S., in the Midwest, use radio and TV to encourage participation. The radio homemakers of Shenandoah, Iowa, would hold events to bring their audience to them as they recorded a program. They would often broadcast from their own homes, if you can imagine, from their kitchens and from their living rooms, and invite people over. I can't imagine being that open with my home, but they invited people in. They invited people to be on the air. They read letters that people had written to them over the air and responded to those letters. They were inclusive. They invited participation. They shared the credit. Not one of these women that I've studied claimed all the credit for herself. Most also pointed to their communities as a source of support, their families. A lot of them mentioned being inspired by their mothers in particular. They talked of something Jill Geisler called generational generosity, and I loved that phrase. And by that, she meant that she felt supported by older women who respected what she was doing and sort of paid it back. And similarly now, she tries to pay it forward, as a lot of these other women do, by working with college students and setting up scholarships. So you see this support moving among generations that is really important for these women's success. They also seek a variety of perspectives. They don't think of themselves as the authority. They think of themselves as one voice among many, and they really encouraged multiplicity of voices. So that was really important for them as well. Oops. Go back here. Okay. So the next theme, dialogue. These women talked and emphasized talk. They were leaders in discussions of social issues. Right? I mentioned Fran Harris talking about pedophilia and mental illness and addiction. these were all subjects that at one point tended to be private and taboo and something that people didn't talk about. These women were all interested in getting those things out in the open and getting multiple perspectives around the table. In Cleveland, Dorothy Fuldheim, the red-haired fireball on television, actually prevented a mass transit strike by bringing labor and management together on the air to resolve their differences. And she said, quote, "There had been no precedent for a broadcaster to take such an action, and I was considered a freak. However, strike averted, she actually got the two sides talking to each other." These women also tended to be very good interviewers. As I mentioned, Dorothy Fuldheim interviewed about 5,000 people over the course of her career. One of her colleagues said later about her, "Dorothy was one of the founders of the talk show form. She, in a sense, gave this to the world." So they tackled tough issues. They encouraged multiple perspectives around those issues. They also encouraged people to think about solutions. They were solution-minded rather than just bringing the problems out into the open. They would also look for solutions to those problems, right? So when Fran Harris, when she started traffic court, part of her mission was not just to allow people to kind of gawk at these real-life court cases, but her mission was actually public safety. She wanted to educate people about traffic safety and thought by doing this, this would help solve a problem that the community had. They encouraged dialogue with their audiences. Dorothy Fuldheim in Cleveland made it her mission to personally respond to every single letter or phone call that she received from a viewer. And of course, not all of them were kind, especially after there were shootings at Kent State University in 1970. Some of you might remember that from history. It was a pretty sordid episode. There was an anti-war protest on campus, and the National Guard was called in, and 4 students, ended up killed. And Dorothy Fuldheim called it murder on television. Her station got a lot of feedback about that, and not very positive feedback. But she engaged with her critics, even when they disagreed with her. Her station stood behind her, and a dialogue was allowed to emerge. They were open to feedback. They weren't defensive about it. Again, encouraging participation and wanting to create content on radio and television that would serve their communities. And finally, creativity. Lynn Gratz is somebody I have not mentioned yet. She was one of the first 5 students in the broadcasting sequence at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. She was admitted into that program somewhat reluctantly. The dean at the time did not believe women should be in the program, and if a woman were to get married or become pregnant, she would be kicked out of the program. So she told me that she very intentionally waited until after she graduated to get engaged. These are things that, in terms of administrative policy, just don't fly now, but at the time, that was the battle that she was facing. She was also told in an informational interview that she did with a network news president, she asked, would you ever allow a woman to do the news? And she was told, no, I wouldn't allow a woman to do the news because they're not authoritative enough, no one would believe them, and they get really irritable once a month. And she said, you can quote me on that. I have the recording. This is what she was told. So her point was that the only opportunities were those that we created for ourselves. Nobody was going to give us the opportunity. We had to make the space for ourselves. And she did this by working on the promotion side of television and rose through the ranks in Omaha, in St. Louis, and she ended up in New York City at CBS as director of communications and the spokeswoman for that network's broadcasting group. People have often spoken of how experimental radio and television was in the early years. Nobody knew what they were doing. I told you about Judith Waller of Chicago, who initially said, I don't see how I could come run a radio station because I barely know what a radio is. And he said, that's okay. Nobody else does either. She said, we were all pioneering. Fran Harris said, quote, we did things in the early days whether we knew it was possible to do them or not. Nobody had done them, and so we just tried. And it was great fun. So what I've been able to see is that women used the experimental culture of those new technologies when they were still new to try things, to be creative, to see what worked and what didn't work. And in those early days, if you were willing to do the work, and if you could create results for your station, people let you do it. So they had to create their opportunities for themselves. And they had to have a really strong work ethic. But again, I think that it really all goes back to that sense of community. They were tied to their communities and both supported their communities and were supported by them. And that's a lesson that I've taken away from this history. And I'm curious to hear from you and whether this resonates with you, or if you think back to your life, if you think back to women that you grew up with or that you've known who maybe did some pretty amazing work but didn't get as much credit as they should have. I'm curious to know what your experiences and thoughts are. And questions. I like questions too, if anybody has any. Yeah. No questions? Yeah.
What do you like about working in the communication field?
What do I like about working in the communication field? I like that it's an entry to so many different subjects, and it leads me to so many other interests, because it's a gateway to whatever your passion is, whether that's sports, whether that's music, whether it's history, whether it's science, right? Communication is, everybody needs communicators. Everybody needs to be able to tell a good story, or they need people to tell their stories. And so I just find that it has led me to so many passions that are unexpected for me.
So much of what you said resonated with me in many ways, but in particular, we talk about the digital disruption, and why it's non-linear. So you talked about traditionally we think of it being linear.
Right.
Many of the things you talk about, the women that were successful, they're doing some of the things that they're saying is why digital is so popular.
Exactly.
It's that interaction and tie-on. So they were pioneers in that sense as well.
Yeah, exactly. That is something that has been the most interesting to me, is that the way that we think about the digital disruption is we think of radio, television, print, as being this sort of kind of one-way communication, and that it's been decentralized essentially by the internet, right? Now everybody's a blogger, everybody can publish, it's disrupted us, and it's nonlinear, except that for them, the way that they worked with broadcasting in the early years was not linear. So I find part of what I think is important about that is that I think it shows the importance of taking women's experiences into account when you're creating models of how things work. Because I think that if you, and not just women's experiences or uses of media, but it's important to take diversity into account and look at how a lot of different communities use media, because I think that we can get stuck on thinking how a white middle class, male uses radio and television or thinks of it, and somehow that becomes the model. I think that we need to diversify our perspective. I think that's a good point.
Because we live in a diverse world, right?
Yes, we do.
Right.
I have a question. Are there women that you can think of now that history might remember as pioneers, looking back 10, 20, 30 years? Are there women in the industry now that you can think of that are doing some of the similar types of things that you've discussed?
That's a really good question, and I had never thought about it from that perspective. It's interesting because what research, we were talking about the digital disruption, but research on women and the internet has shown too is that in the 90s, when a lot of this technology was new, a lot of women took advantage of those opportunities, became members of the digital team in newsrooms when that was new. Took advantage of the opportunity to learn a new technology and to be an early adopter. And then over time, as the potential of the new medium became more apparent, they tended to get squeezed out, which is also what happened with radio and television as well. But kind of, looking at the landscape, I think it's the young women. Well, I think it's young people in general, but I think it's their approach to news, which doesn't always fall in the same silos that it always has, right? Like we've tended to divide things by politics, by sports, by local government, by the kind of the beats that have long been in existence. And I think that one of the things that the newer journalists are doing is disrupting that a little bit. So you're getting people who are covering issues of race and gender, covering diversity. Now that crosses politics and it crosses sports and it crosses local government, right? So I think that's where we're seeing a lot of the innovation.
Thank you.
Do you feel like you possibly were led to research this because society today lacks the opportunity for women to participate in journalism and broadcasting?
Thank you for that question. It's a really good question. And I will tell you the reason that I ended up in this area of research is explained a little bit by the statistics. If you go into a typical journalism classroom at colleges and universities across the country, statistically what you find, and I see this in my own classrooms, the classes are about 2/3 female and 1/3 male. Most of my students, the majority of my students, are female. What happens then when you go into the industry is that ratio flips, and newsrooms still tend to be about 2/3 male and 1/3 female. And this was something that I experienced when I went into journalism. I was an undergraduate student in journalism at Iowa State, and I graduated and went into a newsroom. You come from an environment that is, it's college. It's kind of an idealistic type of environment. And I think, I went into the newsroom and the culture was a lot different from what I expected. And I at the time, I couldn't have articulated that to you because I didn't understand what I was really experiencing. But I knew that there were things that didn't feel right to me. And when I went to graduate school, then I became a little more interested, I think, in what is going on, and what are some ways that I can talk about what's happening and kind of maybe make sense of my own experience, right? I think that's a really good question. And I think that a lot of it is cultural. It's not always, it's not always, a lot of these women were just flat out told no. And that's not always the case, right? You're not always told no. It's just, for some reason, you just don't quite feel like you fit in, or there are unspoken rules that you can't really figure out, or, you aren't part of the group that goes out for beers after work, or, there's like all that kind of informal, more cultural stuff that happens. And, I think that still happens to an extent, although I really do think it's changing.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in a family with very strong female roles, and I was lucky enough to have that with my mother, my grandmother, and my sisters. But I know a lot of people who grew up in families where the man was the man of the household. They were the strong force. And you talk about culture in these journalistic jobs and things. How do you think we change the culture to be more open to feminism and equality?
Well, I think you nailed it. I think it starts at home. And, it starts with how we raise our kids. I think it happens, again, informally, maybe through our personal relationships. Just, pointing out that there's, a different perspective on something. I will say kind of to this point that, there's still a pay gap. And that's something that comes up in my research, that the women I've interviewed have talked about. And, I'll tell you that if you're a guy and you're married to somebody in the workforce, that pay gap is going to mean something to you when it's affecting like the check that she's bringing home too, right? I mean, sometimes like the people that you're close to, when things impact them materially, they end up affecting you materially. And but I also think conversations like this are really important to be able to talk about these things. And whether that happens like with your friends or in your families, or in venues like this. I mean, I guess I'm on the side of these women. I think talk is important. I don't know. Do you all have any thoughts on that? Do you think things are changing? I mean, especially I'm curious to hear from the students. Like, what kinds of things do you hear in your social networks and classes? I'm hearing my students talk about issues related to diversity quite a bit, more than they used to. I think that's great. I think it's really important.
One of the things that I was thinking of is amateur journalism and the opportunities that exist with CNN and Fox and with the internet, the ability for almost anyone to jump online and to write an article, produce it, put it out there, and then promote it through mediums like Facebook and Instagram or whatever else they might promote it through. What has that done for women in journalism?
I think that's a really important point, because when I was talking about community for the women that I've been studying, for them, at that point in time, they really defined their communities geographically, like by the towns that they lived in. And I think more and more, a lot of us are finding community online, not in necessarily our physical spaces, but I think we're finding communities of interest with like-minded people online. And I think that what's important about the ability to publish and to promote, to do your own work and to promote your own work, part of the way that that's happening is that these communities are springing up, and almost organically. And so it makes it possible to start to get a following, right? That, that helps you get noticed, and that helps give you sort of a built-in audience, so that if you go to apply for a job, you can say, well, I bring with me this, this number of followers on Twitter, or, you have kind of some, not just a portfolio of work like it used to be, that you would just show a future employer, but you can show them an audience as well, and the community that sort of comes with you. So I think that's, I think that's a really important point.
Any other questions?
So where does Oprah fit into this?
Where does Oprah fit into this? That is a good question. Well, she's not Midwestern by origin. So because I struggled with, well, I wonder if I should include her. But I think she's from, I want to say Tennessee, somewhere south. Mississippi? Okay. So she's from somewhere south, but I think it's an interesting point, because if you think about a lot of the themes that I'm finding in these more local women's stories, community, inclusion, dialogue, she definitely embodies all of those, right? She brought that to the nation in a pretty major way. And, on a much bigger scale, maybe, than anybody ever had.
But is she the first woman to own a channel, or a cable channel?
Is she the first woman to own her own cable channel? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, she's certainly the first woman to be as, wealthy as she is from what she's, achieved in broadcasting. I guess it depends on whether you look at what she owns versus, kind of what she's done. But that's a really good question. I'll have to look into that. Mm-hmm.
I think the next step is to look at the intersections. Not just women, but women who identify as lesbian, or a variety of other issues that exist at the intersection, and not just at the individual statuses.
No, I think that's a really important point. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, do you think that it took women to took longer for some women to get into different topics, such as being in the Midwest? Do you think it took some women longer to get into agricultural reports, being that may have been seen as more of a man's field?
Yeah. Yes, there was definitely kind of a gender divide between food, which was associated with women, and agriculture, which is associated with men, right? So, yes, I would say, yeah, you're absolutely right, that it took longer for women to get into agriculture. It took longer for women to get into sports. I mean, that was kind of one of the last bastions as well. That said, I'm finding that a lot of men listened to these women on the radio when they were out working in their fields. They would put them on when they were in the tractor. And that, I have to say, has surprised me a little bit, because my impression going into this work was that women were talking to other women, and that the audience was kind of as segregated as the content. But that really wasn't the case. I mean, they were really talking to men as well. But no, you're absolutely right about agriculture, politics, sports. Those were all like some of the more male-defined subject areas. Sure.
Hello. My question was, we talked about a little bit about Oprah, and I remember I watched a video about her, and she talked about, the pay gap when she first started broadcasting, like how her co-host, because he had a family and everything, he got paid a lot more than her because she was a single woman. I was just wondering, like now in today's time, since it's more of a uprising for women to be in the workforce and in communication, is there still a gap between women and men?
Yes, there is. So in my own research, I did a survey of people who worked at Iowa newspapers a few years ago, and divided out the results by gender, and a pay gap definitely emerged in that data. And I have found it, across all fields. What I've also learned from the women in broadcasting who spoke specifically about the pay gap was that they, sometimes the thinking goes that women just don't negotiate or they don't ask, and that's why they're not paid more. But the research shows that they have asked, and the women that I've interviewed all talked about running up against that very wall. They would go in to their managers and say, well, this person has less experience and a weaker resume, and I'm doing more work, and somehow he's making more than I am. And they would say, oh, well, he has a family, right? But on the other hand, somebody I talked to said, yep, we all got together, and the person that we sent in was a single mother. And she didn't have a spouse, right? And she went in and said, I'm a single mom. I'm the breadwinner of my family, and I'm not making as much. And the answer was still, no. That ideology of the male breadwinner, it was really hard, and I think it probably still remains really hard to fight against, even when, circumstances are clearly don't, fall into that kind of traditional model. And when we look at things from a more intersectional approach, like obviously, not everybody fits that model of the nuclear family with a husband and a wife. And so I think part of the work that we all need to do is to break down those ideas and those stereotypes, and encourage our colleagues and our employers to see us as individuals.
Yeah. Time for one more question. Does anyone else have a question? Well, thank you, Dr. Lucht. Oh, wait, Mason. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Lucht. Thank you.
Thank you all.